So welcome to the Superhuman Journeys podcast. And before the podcast, myself and Adam were speaking around what it takes to get that humbleness through our personal development journey. And Adam was speaking about this year. He set a goal to get £20,000 of revenue in business. Like all of us, I think listening to this podcast, we all want to have success. We're going through challenging times. And when we view that as an opportunity, that's when we can be in a better space mentally to move forward. And whether we've got a team or we work on our own, when we have goals and direction, it helps us achieve those. And what really stood out to me before we were speaking, Adam, was that you set that goal for 20,000 profit, but actually you've exceeded that goal quite significantly. And I just, whether you could talk to the listeners about how you did that and what were some of the key things to get you to that goal that you are now.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess, for me, I'm kind of known as a hypnotherapist, but actually, my first proper business was a PR agency, which I created at the age of 23. And it's a broadcast PR agency. And we've been turning over just shy of £1 million a year for the last few years. It's been kind of quite stable, but I kind of, for me, I was ending up making more money from things like property and things like my hypnosis, which I just call my lucrative hobby. It's not a proper business for me. It's just something I do, and it kind of pays me quite well, because I think when you make an impact on people, people pay you. So I was kind of a couple of years ago questioning, did I actually want to continue running this PR agency, or should I actually kind of, sell that, break away from that, and just kind of focus on my role as a hypnotist? And actually, for me, this goal of making £20,000 profit per month came from me asking myself the question is, how much would it need to give me back in order for me to keep justifying my time doing that? Because when you have got different things that you can do, there is an opportunity cost from sticking to one decision and not moving to something else. So I decided at the beginning of the year that in order for me to keep doing this PR agency, it would have to give me an average profit of £20,000 per month. And I set that in the intention. And January and February weren't great months for us. Certainly that profit wasn't there. But there were certain things that I'd already put in place from last year that gave me clues. So our last financial year was the best financial year on record. And this financial year is set to smash that. But what really happened is we started, and it was really lockdown that was the catalyst, increasing revenue. Fortunately, as a combination of the lockdown situation, a lot of our overheads went down massively as well. So clients were no longer traveling to meetings. We weren't having to pay for external studio hire. We had various other things that suddenly went down as well. And due to revenue increasing and overheads decreasing, actually the profit went up significantly. And actually we're kind of averaging around about 30, 40K per month. And in fact, one month we've had 80K profit. And for me, it was a weird thing, because for a lot of my 20s and 30s, I was this money hungry kind of person. And that was my kind of key motive. And when I become a hypnotherapist, actually my priority shifted from financial to fulfillment. And I really wanted to have an impact on the lives of other people. And it's just a real ironic thing that at the point where I've actually moved away from chasing the money, the money has increased, purely as a result of me focusing on what fulfills me, but also how I can have the biggest impact on other people. And I think it was a not done on purpose that way, but it was a side effect of me shifting my values and my priorities. And as a consequence of that, the money follows. And that's kind of a lesson I wish I would have learned in my mid-20s. I was reasonably financially successful in my 20s, but it's certainly moving in a better direction now, I think, because of my shift in focus.
Yeah, that's interesting, because we always have those things in hindsight. But actually, we always have to go on that journey up until now. So there's probably a good reason why you didn't learn that back then, because you've changed as a person. And And now, as you say, when you shift your focus, it's interesting, really interesting that you say that, because it's something I've been experiencing recently. And we'll just talk about it from a boxing standpoint, because I know that you like training. But I've been learning boxing for about 2 or 3 years, and I've got this. There's a thing called a floor to ceiling ball, which is kind of like 2 elastic bands, and the ball goes everywhere. Now, the interesting thing is when you focus on the ball, hitting the ball, and you focus solely on the ball, you actually miss it quite a lot, and it gets quite frustrating. But when you focus past the ball, or you focus below the ball, your hit rate goes up like exponentially, just from actually not focusing on the ball. So I like what you say there, that actually a lot of business owners are focused on, how do I make my next client? How do I get that money? Or actually, if we focus on delivering an amazing podcast, for instance, or adding great value through videos, or creating a book, for instance, the natural byproduct of that is more money and clients, because we're serving and we're fixing problems for people, which I really like. And there was a key thing you were speaking about before we got on the podcast around how you now view your teams. And there'll be a lot of business owners or people with teams listening to the podcast. So it'd be great to go through that kind of mindset shift that you went through around working with and developing your teams.
Yeah, I mean, I'd been running my hypnotherapy practice for about 2 years. And that was becoming quite successful. I had high profile clients. I was getting lots of coverage in the media. But my PR agency wasn't doing as well. And subconsciously, is because I resented it. It was kind of like I found this new thing that I really wanted to be doing. And then the PR agency felt like it was a barrier, like it was getting in the way of me doing what I really wanted to do. And because of that, because of the attitude that I had to it, the resentment that I had to it, I think it was bringing a different energy to me. And I remember thinking, well, what is it that I love about hypnosis? Well, it's about changing people's lives. It's about having an impact on their life. It's about helping them to have breakthroughs and create change. And just an idea popped into my head. It's kind of like, well, what if I stop looking at my employees as employees with that kind of, you know, standard default mentality that most business owners have with employees, that they're assets and liabilities, and, you know, they could be problems and, you know, all this kind of stuff. What if I started thinking of my employees more like hypnosis or coaching clients, that I start looking at a way to empower them, to help them earn more, to help them progress, to help them grow. And when I did that, the results were pretty dramatic, pretty quick. You know, it shifted from me losing £70,000 in 2 months to turning it to profitability relatively quickly. And then that's fed into this year where profits gone up even more. But in a PR agency, profit comes from the people, and the people comes from the culture and the relationship and the management style with those people. And I think that comes from the beliefs fundamentally of the owner or management. And, you know, I had this kind of entitled viewpoint that if I'm paying people a salary, they should be producing value. They should be working hard. And of course, like, we should all do the very best of our lives, but that doesn't mean we all do. And there sometimes is genuine reasons why that doesn't. And when I shifted my role from how do I monitor productivity, how do I monitor results, to how do I empower my staff to be more valuable, feel more trusted, to be more effective. And I noticed my language training, you know, changing straight away. I remember literally saying, you know, for the last almost 2 years, I've been saying this, like, my job is to find the right people, give them the right tools, the right support, the right training, and get out of their way. You know, it couldn't be more of the opposite of micromanagement. You know, another phrase I use a lot is, if I need to motivate someone, I've got the wrong person. So I don't have to spend my time motivating staff anymore. I just let it know that the culture is, I'm expecting self-motivation. And then my goal is to empower those already motivated people to do the very best. And it was just a mindset shift. And it was super ironic, because there I was for years helping other people shift their mindset and their beliefs and things. And yet I wasn't actually looking inwards at my own situation. And when I actually started, you know, practicing what I preached, things changed and changed quickly.
Yeah, I like that. Practice what you preach. But I think when we're viewed that way, we never get a chance to look back at ourselves And one big things I've noticed when doing coaching in corporates is that time for self-reflection, or that chance to look at yourself. Because one of the things I always talk about when I do leadership coaching or awakening leadership is that you can't lead other people before you're leading yourself. And the big misconception is, I've got to get my team motivated, that it's their problem, they need to do this, they need to do that. When actually, first of all, is that, are you leading your life first? Have you got all the elements within your life? Are you walking your talk? Because that's an important part for people to respect the leader. And also, there's a presupposition there. If you are a leader, why would people want to follow you, and where are you taking them? Because it means some type of direction, which sounds like you've had a real mindset shift and you're taking those people within a different direction. And I really like what you said around the fostering trust, and letting people do their role and trusting them to do their role. Because we hire people, and this is one thing that I've spoke about previously, is that we hire people because of their strengths, because of their uniqueness, because of their superhuman talents and what they do well. It's like, and then what we do, what a lot of companies do, is they beat the talents out of them. They focus on what they're not very good at, and they spend all their time coaching in L&D, closing their skill gaps. So the things they're not very good at, how about just, you've hired them for what they're really good at? How about just keep honing that and putting them in that direction? But the most important thing around trust is fostering that equality with teams. One big thing I've seen previously is where one person's treated one way, another person's treated that way. So the more I think we can focus on equality, and that's having a standard which is standardized, which everybody adheres to, I think that's a good foundation for motivated and performing teams. It would be great to get, before we get into your superhuman journey, it'd be great to get your perspective on the importance of equality in business and teams.
Massively. And I think equality comes hand in hand with hypocrisy, because if people feel that things aren't fair, then, why would they follow the leadership in place? And I think what I found has really helped develop that culture, is truly make decisions from a perspective of fairness rather than favoritism. And I think that's an important element of equality. But equally, it's about transparency. And a lot of the performance structures that we have in place is not, cloak and dagger, secretive. It's very transparent. It's on shared documents that everyone can see, and that way the team starts managing themselves and starts competing with each other, because everybody knows what everyone else is doing, achieving, and that kind of stuff. And I think that also cultivates that element of equality, because if the people that progress and are rewarded and are praised and recognized are the people that are performing, it does two things. One, it makes those people working hard and delivering results feel good. But secondly, it lets everyone else know that this is what we value in this particular company and organization. And if they want those things, then, do the same kind of things in the same kind of way. And again, that transparency facilitates that. And I think if I didn't have certain technology that facilitates that element of transparency, things like Google Sheets, things like Trello boards, things like that, I think managing a team of about 30 people when they're all working from home would be very tricky. You can't micromanage people in their own homes. You need to have the right culture, you need to have the right structure, you need to have the right systems and training and expectations. But once you've got that stuff in place, it actually becomes easier, because, right now I know that my team's working, and I don't have to check up on them. I just know that based on the mutual trust, based on I trust them to do their job, and they're trusting me that I don't have to check up on them. But if I did look at the analytics, it's highly transparent and I can see what's going on. So that trust, and my approach on trust is that people don't have to earn trust, but they can lose trust. And trust can be lost very quickly. And when I have had to get rid of staff, it's mainly because there's been a breakdown in trust. And if you can't trust an employee, particularly in this time when so many people are working from home, it's not viable. So there is that still that element, I think, of any business owner, that they have to kind of figure out what are their red lines, what are their lines in the sand, that if someone passes them or crosses them, it's not viable, because again, that actually helps to develop the right kind of culture, because people like to know where they stand. And coming back to your question on fairness, if what's acceptable for one person is completely unacceptable for someone else, nobody knows where they stand. And therefore, you don't have the culture, and people have anxiety and uncertainty. So you've got to be very, very consistent as a business owner. Otherwise, it's very tricky for the team to know what kind of place they're in. Or, I mean, we've all had terrible bosses. I remember a boss that how he would treat people would depend entirely on what mood he was on that particular day. How do you work in an environment like that? It becomes impossible, because you don't have any job security at that point. Because if the boss is in a bad mood, you might be fired on the spot, just to kind of instill a culture of fear. And then there are certain things that I think just aren't not only are not a good idea, but aren't really viable in these days anyway. But I think there are lots of responsibilities on business owners. I think people look at business owners and say, oh, okay, well, they make all the money and people do all the work and this kind of stuff. No, there is risk involved. There is responsibility involved. There is pressure involved, and it's not smooth sailing. And I think for a lot of people, there is a lack of appreciation as to the bit that they don't normally see, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting perspective there, because they come to do that role, they come to do their job, and they often, I think, as a business owner, when times might be challenging or you're having difficult conversations, you want to, in a way, be a great leader by guarding them from that, and telling them what they need to know, and what they don't need to know, because you want to keep them focused on what they're doing. You don't want there's enough distractions in the world with social media and things that are going on in the world and in people's lives. So it's keeping that ship sailing forward. And I remember um, a boss that wasn't a particularly great leader. And one of the things in MBIT, which we call, is pseudo leadership, which means pretend leadership. And then there's real leadership, which is compassionate, inspiring, thoughtful, thinking about the team, being courageous. Pseudo leadership is very much around having a title and being, dictatorial. But I see a lot of people on LinkedIn that have leadership titles, and it's not detracting away from that they've been successful in their career, but it's almost like there's a lot of people that chase that job title, and have they actually earned it? Have they actually earned to be able to call themselves that leader? And I always find that a very, very interesting perspective around real leadership and that pseudo leadership, which is leading by fear, as you said, leading by fear, not knowing whether that person's in an inspired mood, or that they're going to come and give you a bollocking, for instance, or whether they have your best interests at heart as well. Because I think that's very important as well, to be able to have those, as a leader, have those honest conversations and saying, look, that's not working, this isn't working for me. And almost, I think the erosion of trust comes from when somebody gets feedback about their performance from somebody else, or they hear some hearsay. And I think that's a very important piece. Before you finish work, before you finish the week, go and have that conversation if you've fallen out with somebody, and have that honest conversation before the following week comes. Because the white elephant in the room, per se, is essentially people not having those conversations for months, years on end. And it's almost like they are pretending in some way, not having that honest conversation.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's again the responsibility to address those things, because I've been guilty of this. I've in my head, I've been frustrated at someone's laziness. I've been frustrated at someone's, lack of performance, but I haven't actually fed back, my assessment of it. I've not investigated where they're at. How do they think they're doing? And sometimes there can be a huge disconnect. I could be angry with someone, but they're feeling unsupported. And sometimes a little bit of communication can solve both things. And you can turn someone that, is feeling dissatisfied, isolated, into someone that's loyal and high performing. So you're right. Communication is such a vital ingredient.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the things we're going to be communicating now is obviously your superhuman journey from when you were younger up until now. Obviously, you've developed a business and become a millionaire. You've got very successful businesses and some very successful podcasts around mindset. And obviously, you're most recognized for hypnotherapy as well, working with CEOs and celebrities. So there'll be a lot of coaches, business owners, people in corporate that would love to hear about your journey. So if you could take everybody through your journey from when you were younger and the path that's got you all the way up until now having this conversation.
Yeah. So my childhood was, I would say, a mixed childhood. I had supportive parents. My mother came from a working class family, my father from a middle class family. Both have got very strong work ethic. And throughout my childhood, we lived in 3 different places. I was born in Hastings, lived in Peterborough, and then moved to Derbyshire in my teenage years. And the reason for moving was always the employment of my dad. But for me, the overall theme, I'd say there's 2 key themes in my childhood that I feel have a big impact on my life today. And one was this desire to learn. So, I was this weird kid that, while I was still in primary school, I was reading books on speed reading and memory and like bizarre things. Like, honestly, like, I think what a weirdo. But I had this hunger to kind of not just learn, but learn about things that would speed up the ability to learn. So, um, odd things, but like psychology and creativity and things like that. And it was only later, much later, that I figured that this eagerness to kind of improve myself, to exercise, to learn, to kind of get better, came from a fundamental belief of not being good enough. And I think that's the plus side of any belief. And as a hypnotherapist, my belief is that beliefs are not good or bad. They're just useful or not useful. They're empowering or disempowering. So the positive side of the belief of not believing that you're good enough is that if you are quite smart and quite resourceful and you don't genuinely believe you're good enough, you invest time and effort to become better. And that's really where I think a lot of people attracted to personal development and self-improvement at some level either have or have had the belief of not being good enough. They want to become a better version of themselves, which is a very noble motive. The problem is that the belief of not being good enough is almost like a mirage. So as you get better and you still believe you're not good enough, then you're constantly playing catch up and you constantly have to do it, which again is a good thing. Tony Robbins talks about this kind of philosophy of constant and never ending improvement. It's a good philosophy, but the energy attached to not being good enough means that there is always an element of inferiority, anxiety, or scarcity. So whenever you've improved, it's still not quite there. So that was one theme throughout my childhood. I genuinely had this kind of inferiority complex. The other key phrase and key theme throughout my childhood is anxiety. I would be scared to do stuff, lots of things, scared to talk to girls, scared to kind of join a club, scared to kind of do certain things. So I would say not being good enough and being anxious, probably the overall themes of my childhood right up into my teenage years. And in my first year of university, where I was studying psychology, I effectively had such severe anxiety that I became a recluse for a few months, only leaving my bedsit to go to the supermarket, in a 24-hour supermarket, get food, come back straight away. Basically, I was in a prison, and this bedsit was so small, it was smaller than most prison cells. But I was voluntarily being located in this place. I missed virtually my whole first year of university, just kind of sat there in this room, just watching mind-numbing TV. And it forced me to reach a point of a crossroads where I said, look, I was in this weird dichotomy where I kind of had these huge dreams and big plans, and yet I couldn't even leave my room without, having a panic attack. And it was just like this weird dichotomy that forced me to say, look, I've got a choice here. Either I accept that this is my life, this is my destiny, and I'm not going to amount to very much, or I make a commitment to myself to figure out what has to change, make those changes, And then suddenly this new future opens up for me. And luckily I took that second option, partly because I had very little to lose. You know, at the point where you think, right, well, I could be this kind of, you know, 20-year-old hermit, like never leaving his room. That's not a desirable future. But it was a reflection of the beliefs, my insecurities, my fears at that particular time that created that. But thankfully, by me being able to make changes in those areas, I changed my beliefs. I faced my fears. You know, I had anxiety work for me rather than against me. Weirdly, I didn't realize it at the time, but weirdly, that was almost like boot camp training. It was kind of like that toughened me up enough so that when you've got fears of launching a business, well, I face bigger fears than this. When you've got fears of speaking to an audience of 500 people, well, that's nothing compared to what I was facing before. It really toughened me up psychologically so that I'd gone from this hyper anxious teenager not doing anything to quite an arrogant guy in my 20-year-old, kind of making up for lost time. That, okay, now that I know I can face these fears, nothing's going to stop me. And, you know, we talked about humbleness a bit. I was not humble at all in my 20s. You know, I took this new lease of life, this new superpower of being able to influence my own emotional state, and I ran with it. And I was financially successful, and you know, it came with cockiness and arrogance. But as life tends to, you know, you get wake up calls every now and then, and so long as you learn from them, you can evolve and you can continue to change.
Yeah, and it's a nice story of learning. I'd imagine quite a lot from your parents, that, you know, they said around having a strong work ethic, which you had the contrasts of your mom, who was working class, and your dad, who was the middle class, and the family revolved around his work, and then getting to the point where I think a lot of us experience those not good enough, that level of anxiety. And, you know, I certainly have experienced that as well. And I think it's trying to communicate something to us. And from my perspective, it's almost like trying to communicate that there is plans for you, there is a purpose for you, and this is almost like, as they say in the hero's journey, this is your cave to kind of go into. And when you start, as you say, as you start to move through those different fears, they seem so real. They seem almost like brick walls. Then when you move through them, once you've gone through them, you're almost like moving through one of those little fly curtains, and it just kind of dissipates. But as you say, it starts to develop your psychology, that actually now when you have those decisions, because what it was a decision that got you to change your life, because you're at a crossroads, like many people listening at a crossroads, maybe within their life or business or career, that actually it was a decision. And when you started to face those fears, as from what I'm hearing, when you started to face those fears, what happened is you had almost like in NLP, like a resource anchor. So when you had a decision to make, and it felt like fear, or it felt anxious, or this is a big decision, you could then picture the time when something was even harder, and actually then that made that less significant, so then you could decide a lot easier. And it'd be great to speak to people that are listening. What are some of the practical tips, or what are some of the insights that you learned in that moment when you were at university, were like, I've now got to decide the direction of my life? Because although that was you at university, people will relate to that maybe where they are in their life. So what are some of the insights and the practical tips that you would give people to help redirect their life if they're in that type of situation?
I think for me, the fortunate thing that I did, it wasn't a conscious thing, but the fortunate thing that I did is that I was willing to take 100% responsibility rather than look outwards. And I think if someone in my condition would have seen me at that point, you know, depressed, highly anxious, they would say, see a doctor. They've got pills for that kind of stuff. But for me, that would be projecting outwards. Whereas my hope, maybe from all the books I was reading as a kind of a kid and a teenager, but I had this belief that I'd created this misery, this anxiety. I'd done this, and it was entirely based on what I was thinking and what I was believing. So that led me to a chain of thought that if I change that, then suddenly everything could change, which turned out to be true, but that could just be a self-fulfilling prophecy. the belief facilitated the resources to achieve the outcome. So I would say step one, that I found useful, I can't project it on anyone else, is taking responsibility for the misery, the stagnation that I was in. I didn't try and blame it on anyone. I looked at myself in the mirror and said, I did this, and that helped me because then I could change it. And secondly, I think the other thing is, people saw this kind of transformation in me, and it kind of looked like magic. It was kind of like, right there, I'm still connected to people on Facebook that I used to go to school with, and they remember this kind of, very nervous, anxious, kind of kid basically. And now they see me doing all these different things. So it kind of looks impressive from the outside, but the reality is, it wasn't a straight line. I tried certain things, and then I kind of, I fell back, and, it was a constant feedback loop. And one of the beliefs, and it's one of the presuppositions of NLP, but a belief that I really subscribe to, is that there's no failure, only feedback. So when things didn't go to plan, rather than, right, I tried that, didn't work, it was like, well, I've tried that and it didn't give me what I want, so what else can I try? And it kept me in that resourceful state to keep doing stuff. And not everything I've done has been successful by any means. I'd probably say I've failed at more stuff than I've succeeded, but I do try and learn as much as I can for when it doesn't go right. I try and pick something out of that. And what that enabled me to do is create a decision-making framework. So whatever happens, I win. And when I launched my PR agency at the age of 23, I'd saved up about 15 grand from working a couple of years, kept my overheads low. That was my seed capital to launch my business. And I remember, and people still knew me as this kind of anxious kind of person. I said, yeah, I'm planning on setting up my own business. I'm gonna quit my job. I'm gonna set my own business. And the two main responses I got was kind of, oh, okay, yeah, good luck with that. Kind of like, just words. And then the second thing were people worried for me that I was taking such a big risk, and they were trying to protect me. And so, well, don't you think you should, get a bit more experience first? You're still quite young, and all this kind of stuff. So how I kind of weighed it up in my mind is that if I, basically spend this £15,000 launching this business and it fails, then I figured out that that investment in myself would probably give me more business experience than if I did an MBA, than if I did a business course, that I would get real business experience by actually investing in myself. So I figured that if this all goes wrong, I could simply get another job again, and the money I've invested is going to make me better in some way. But equally, if the business was successful, which it turned out to be, then I've done what very few people have done, which is launch a business in my early 20s that's grown, that's scaled, that, that then created an income and wealth for me. So it was kind of in my head, it was kind of like, heads I win, tails you lose. Whatever happens here, I'm coming out of this, in a good place. And I try and make lots of decisions like that, where I try and reduce risk, but make decisions that whatever happens, I'm going to benefit in some way. Either I get what I want or I get the lesson, but either way, I'm going to get something of value.
Yeah, that's really interesting perspective, because the no failure, only feedback. Sorry, the presupposition, um, as you say, it gives you the outcome if you get A and the outcome if you get B. Whereas a lot of people find it challenging because they put all their hopes and dreams and aspirations in that one thing. So in their mind, when it fails, they view failure as it's something about me, it's something wrong with me, and then straight away that puts them in a very unresourceful state, and it can take people a long time to recover from that. Whereas what you're doing is you're creating a win-win in both scenarios, and that enables you to be in a much more resourceful state. And it's interesting because when you were speaking earlier about the part where you're looking at improving those different steps, I think from listening to you when you were younger is that drive for that learning, that hunger for psychology, that hunger and that desire to learn. I think that still drives a lot of your success today, is that hunger to improve and that hunger to learn. And it'd be interesting to learn a little bit more about that, specifically around what did you learn from your parents, which was really significant, that you are still using today, whether that be in business, whether that be in life? What was the biggest learning from both of them? And what was the biggest learning from school when you were in that kind of mindset that you wanted to learn things that almost accelerated learning, but also the byproduct is accelerating results as well?
Mm. So I think the key thing I got from my parents was probably the work ethic. And weirdly, sometimes you learn from the opposite. And the thing that my parents, and people are wired differently. I get that. I'm not projecting my beliefs on anyone else, but they had a very distinctive attitude to risk, and they are very risk averse. They didn't like risks. They're very much rule followers. And that's kind of the opposite of an entrepreneur. So, I remember having conversations with my dad, and it's kind of like, even, 13, 14 years old, I had this idea of businesses. And I remember saying, what do you think about running a business? And within seconds, he was giving me like 95% of businesses fail in the first 3 years kind of statistic. So what I learned from that is that the consequence of a belief, that things are not worth it. If you believe that, you're not even going to attempt. And I could also see from my parents that they both very much had this employee mentality, but that employee mentality wasn't serving them very well. That they were at the whim of being made redundant or being displaced in some way. The decisions were being made by other people, and I would hear conversations where they're complaining about management and decisions, and I'm thinking, well, you're choosing to work there. And I remember very early on thinking, well, if I'm gonna be a master of my own destiny, I can't work for anyone else. um, I just can't do that. So that was probably what I learned most from them, is that if you want something, you got to work hard, but equally, to have a different perspective on risk. What I think I learned from school, is that it doesn't make sense to try and fit in. It kind of does at school, weirdly. I think, at school, there's always a consequence for being the outcast. And for me, having like glasses and frizzy hair, and acne at certain points, it wasn't the best place, particularly when I moved schools at the age of 15 years old. People have already got their friendship groups at that point, and I'm kind of, changing school right in the last year, right before GCSEs. It's kind of like, it's the worst possible time to do it. But again, it toughened me up. It kind of, it made me evaluate myself in a different way, not in the most positive way, but with hindsight, if you go through tough times, it toughens you up. But overall, I think this desire to improve myself and learn was very much self-motivated. I wasn't really interested in what my parents or what the schools were willing to teach me. I did know that I was a fast learner, and I do know that, I've got a good memory. I don't know if I was interested in memory because I had a good memory, or if my memory got good by learning about memory early on. But I learn things very quick. I can have a conversation with someone and then almost like mirror it back verbatim. So it's kind of a useful thing to have that. But I was interested in learning the kind of stuff that nobody wanted to teach me. So I was in the personal development section in the libraries, as a 11, 12-year-old, flicking through these books. So learning about, accelerated learning techniques by Edward de Bono and Tony Buzan, and speed reading books and things like that, purely because at some level I had an interest in that area. I also had an interest in kind of exercise, and I had a weight set when I was in my early teens and things like that. And it genuinely stemmed from this idea of not being good enough and wanting to be better. But I think that curiosity, that thirst for learning, that if I am going to do this stuff, I've got a choice here. I can learn from my own experience, which is going to be a time-consuming way of doing it, or I can try and learn from other people that have already figured out what works. So that, in NLP would call it modeling, that desire to do that was kind of innate in me. Like, I don't have time to learn this myself. I want to learn from other people. When I became a property investor, I read like 5 or 6 different books on property investing. I wasn't willing to kind of only learn from my own experience. I wanted to have the strategies and the ideas from other people to get there quicker. But the interesting thing is that at the age of maybe, I don't know, 28, 29, when I finally figured out about this belief system of not being good enough, my biggest fear at that point is that because I knew, I had the intelligence to know that this belief of not being good enough had fueled my desire to improve and get better. I had this genuine worry that if I no longer had this belief that I wasn't good enough, that perhaps the spring of motivation to improve would disappear. And it didn't. You know, it was a strange thing, is that I became even more motivated to improve and get better, but I wasn't doing it from a place of not being good enough anymore. I was doing it from a place of growth. I wanted to be the very best version of myself. And I think you can do the same thing, but when you do it for a different reason, the energy changes, you know, and the enjoyment changes and the fulfillment changes. So that was my biggest fear, that, you know, am I still going to want to improve and get better? But that wasn't that fear, again, as most fears are, as you said, it's a mirage. You get close to it and it turns out it was never there to begin with.
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective, because almost that not good enough, wanting to improve, it drove that for long periods of your years. But what I've recognized and what I've noticed is that that's energy and that drives us. But there almost comes a point, and I don't know whether you can remember when it changed for you, but there almost comes a point when you realize that there might be a better way of you're utilizing the energy, because obviously, as we know, the belief creates the emotion, and that's energy in motion. And yes, it does work, because I remember when I played rugby, I just wanted to prove people wrong. Mainly because teachers often didn't believe to me at school. So my drive was to prove people wrong. But over time, what that tends to do is affect your emotional energy. So then when we just do things for the love of doing it, or just to do it, that almost becomes very freeing when, as you say, when we have a change in perspective or a different reason for doing that. So I don't know whether you can remember the time when you had that slight change in perspective, where you were, the belief changed for you, and you're like, well, actually, I could use a slightly different belief, or to utilize my energy in a slightly different way.
Yeah, I do actually. And there was 2 different occasions. The first was the freedom that comes from doing things on your own terms. And I've only had a couple of jobs before I set up my own business, but one of those jobs was working at a radio station. And the sales director told me the story about how he got a mortgage on a property way too young, you know, overextended himself, had to basically live on baked beans for a number of months. But what happened is the property went up significantly in the space of a year or two. And he'd figured out that the amount of equity that he had in that property suddenly meant that he could voluntarily choose not to work for a few years at any point in time, and know that he's got that cushion not to do that. But the language that he used to describe it just kind of amazed me. I was compelled by it. He said, you know, it gave him a fuck you attitude.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what's a fuck you attitude? He said, like, I can go into any place where I work and know that if they ask me to do anything that I don't want to do, or if they disrespect me in any way, I can say fuck you and leave it in that moment in time, and know that I can make decisions from wanting to do certain things and not having to do certain things. And I think a lot of people can experience where they've compromised on their values because they've had to do something for their boss, or they've had to do something. But when he told me about this fuck you attitude, I'm like, I want that. I want that attitude. And so that was the first idea of this freedom that you have by living life on your terms. And he said that he's never had to quit or never had to do these things. But he said the energy that he brings into meetings and conversations, people just know that he's got this attitude, so that people aren't willing to take advantage because they know that he's got the ability and willingness to walk away. So it didn't force him to live out the fuck you attitude, but he knew that he had that attitude. So for me, I knew that I wanted that, to have that kind of ability. And for me, that's what wealth represents. It's being able to make choices that you want to, not because you have to. But when I actually changed the belief in not being good enough, It was me working through a Tony Robbins book, Awaken the Giant Within, or maybe Unlimited Power. I think it was Unlimited Power, and it was the bit about belief change where you've got this metaphor of the table with the legs, and then the belief is the tabletop, and the legs are the references. And I became a bit of a detective, and I said, right, I've been doing this, and I've been saying this, and this has caused me problems. What did I have to believe for all of this to make sense? And then the penny drops, like, I don't think I'm good enough, you know. And not only that, I had a second belief as well, and that is that I genuinely believed that I didn't like myself. And at the time, I had very few friends, very few kind of any kind of like social life, really. And then the consequence of that belief of not liking myself is that, well, how is anyone else going to like me if I don't like myself? It became the law of the lid. And in that evening, I changed both beliefs. I went from I'm not good enough to me being more than good enough. I'm good enough to do whatever I want to do. And then the second belief was I don't like myself, to, you know, and it sounds a little bit kind of Californian, kind of like hippie-ish, but, you know, I got to a point where I actually firmly believed not only do I like myself, I love myself.
Mm.
And the more I like myself, the better I am to kind of make connections with other people. And it was just me, pen and pad, working through my beliefs, changing them. And then, as tends to happen when any belief truly changes, you know, you start finding all these references that back up the new belief fairly quickly. And it's easier, as you know, to replace a belief than to create a belief from scratch. So by going from this disempowering belief to you know, two brand new beliefs, it changed everything rapidly, you know. And I've had many moments in my life where, you know, it's not something I just talk about. I actually do on myself. I will literally work on myself, you know, figure out what I don't want anymore, what I'm no longer willing to settle for, make a change, and then stick to it. And the most recent example of that, pretty much 2 years ago, I gave up alcohol. I just realized it wasn't serving me. It wasn't something I wanted to do anymore. Made the change, you know, and once that change was made, it's made. You know, I've not drunk anything in over 2 years.
Yeah, that's a nice. It's a nice description or indication around standards, really, because once your beliefs started to change, different standards come within our lives, and there's a lot of people that want to change their behavior. Whether it's a corporation want to change people's behavior, or people generally looking for change in their life. They're looking, let's change our behaviors. But actually changing our beliefs and then changing our standards is very important as well, because then the standard, it's with a standard, it becomes, did you achieve it, yes or no? It's very clear. So that's an important perspective from your change around those different standards. And then what happens is when we look at our lives and create new standards, who do we aspire to become, and what will we no longer tolerate? Which I remember reading a Tony Robbins quote, which is around, who do I want to become? What will I no longer accept or tolerate? And what are the standards that will help support that? That can create a huge amount of change. And I really like that story of that, actually, that how often do people take some time out and go, right, pause, turn off all my notifications. We're going to work on something for a couple of hours. And actually, I really truly believe that self-reflection and journaling questions and working that out can provide those aha moments, those insights where it just becomes really clear. And things that we might be struggling with internally, actually, when we start to externalize them and work through them on paper, it actually helps the whole healing and the transformation. So I really like that perspective of changing beliefs. And what was interesting earlier when you said around that your parents had an employee mentality, and I think we can all relate to that. You know, my dad certainly had an employee mentality. Then he started his own pub business, and there'll be loads of people now who work for a corporation. At some level, they want to create a vision or a creative project or bring something to the world which will benefit the world, and that might be a business, that might be a creative project. What was your motivation to really start your business and develop a multi-million-pound business? And for those people now that are in that employee mindset, that employee mentality, what are some of the steps that you did to move from the employee type mentality to I suppose building your multi-million-pound businesses?
Yeah. So, I'll answer the second part first. And that is that when I was an employee, I still had an employer mentality. I kind of, there's a book by Brian Tracy called The Psychology of Selling. And chapter one is kind of like, have the mentality that you're already self-employed. So I kind of did, I was on the payroll, but I was kind of thinking, right, um, if I was a contractor to produce certain results for this company, what would need to happen for that to be viable? So I kind of looked at myself as self-employed anyway. And the PR agency that I built had a similar model, but with a very different culture to the one I was working in. So I kind of felt I'm winning twice here, because it's kind of like they're paying me for me to understand their business. I'm getting, almost like all this kind of insight in terms of structures, systems, all this kind of stuff. And they're paying me to do it. And I'm earning commission. And this is my seed capital to launch my business. And my business is still going. And their business failed like 3-4 years after I left. So I think for anyone listening right now that is an employee, just say, well, look, in this uncertain time, what would it be like for you to consider yourself a self-employed freelancer or contractor, but within exactly the same thing? And rather than that you're an employee with all the benefits that it has, just imagine that you've got that kind of, you're not knowing if they're going to rehire you again for another contract at the end of this period. And I think that puts you in a different, more resourceful, more accountable model anyway. I think the second bit in terms of the thought process of creating a multi-million pound business, I never set out to do that. I just kind of knew that I didn't want to work for anyone else. And this business that I'd worked for, I thought I can replicate this. This could be my shortcut to, becoming a business owner relatively young and learning all the lessons that come with this. Because if I started a business in my early 40s, I'd be kind of where I was in my early 20s. So I kind of felt like if I'm going to be a business owner and I don't really want to be an employee, let's get in this game early, because then I'm going to learn all the lessons that I need to. That said, there were certain things that I did that I think helped me. And one of them was manage my perception. So at the age of 23, when I set the business up, I looked about 17. It's got such a baby face, I looked very young. But I did certain things to manage the perception. So I built a half decent website. I had a serviced office in Covent Garden in a really prestigious address. I bought a phone number with 4 zeros on the end to make it look like a multinational phone number. I got a bank account in the Mayfair branch of HSBC so that suppliers would see me in this Mayfair thing. The signature on my email wasn't me as the managing director, but as an account director. So I did the opposite of what you were saying before, where people have artificially high titles. I had an artificially low title. So the big brands that I was working with, Sony and Panasonic, they would think I was an employee of a bigger company rather than the managing director of being so young. Because I knew if they see me as a managing director at 23 years old, they're going to be thinking, well, what kind of organization is this? I can't work with that. So I was able to kind of preempt the perceptions involved, but basically to project the idea of a much bigger company. I voluntarily had the company VAT registered even before it reached the VAT threshold, because I knew that big companies are going to have question marks if they're working with a company without a VAT number. So there were lots of little things that I did to kind of manage the perception of a much bigger company, even when I was a one-man band. So I think there was an element of vision there. And the second thing is, because I knew that I wanted to be wealthy, to have that fuck you attitude. I also, when I knew that I wanted to become not just a one-man band, but actually have a business, I actually bought the property that I'm in at the moment. It's a property in North London, probably valued at about $500,000 now, but I bought it at auction. All the money I'd made from the first 2 years of working in a 1-bedroom flat in Luton and a serviced office in Covent Garden, I basically gambled on buying a commercial property at auction. That was my first ever property that I bought. And then basically the business paid the rent to me individually. And then the company, or the company has improved the property, which I still own as an individual. So I've never looked at it as I just want to be a business owner. It's kind of like business is a vehicle to generate cash. The cash acquires assets. Those assets appreciate in value, which gives me fundamentally what I've always wanted, which is freedom to make my own choices. And that led me 5 years ago, 6 years ago, to training as a clinical hypnotherapist, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. And also at that point in time, I wanted an escape route from my PR agency that I'd kind of lost the enthusiasm for. But weirdly, by pursuing this other area that I had a lot of enthusiasm for, I've actually been able to map those skills back across to the original business, and that's improved as well. So I'd love to say it was some, prison break style strategic game plan right from the offset. No, it kind of wasn't. I'm just responding to what's happening, making choices and trying to make the best that I can in whatever situation, but trying to think at least 1 or 2 moves ahead, so that rather than paying rent and making someone else rich, I can have my own property, my own asset, and then, use that to kind of keep moving forward.
Yeah, it's just I think when I speak to people on the podcast, there is, as you say, the strategic point of view. There never usually is. It's just following your intuition and following what's in front of you, and then trying to look at what might be coming up ahead. And that's a really interesting perspective. And the drive for freedom and working for yourself, obviously, that's a good motivation to have that sense of freedom and wanting to work for yourself, and then using all those different assets to essentially grow your business. So I really like that. And it'd be really interesting to talk about, because I know you mentioned wealth earlier, the importance of the wealth and how you develop the mindset around that. It'd be great to kind of get your perspective and insights. I know that you developed a course around how to create wealth. I think it's something to do with hypnotherapy or something along those lines. I read about that. It's all around that wealth. What are some of the key themes within that, where people can learn to I don't know, reprogram their mind to attract or to have a better wealth mindset?
Yeah. So the talk and the program that I've created is called Hypnotic Wealth, because most hypnotherapists are not wealthy at all. Most hypnotherapists don't have any hypnotherapy clients, which is the strange thing. And you get this weird incongruency, because for me, hypnotherapy is a superpower, because if you can change any part of your behavior, beliefs, or mindset, the obvious question is, what can't you do? Which is how I look at hypnotherapy. If I want to be able to do something, if I can activate the right resources and the right mentality. So seeing overweight hypnotherapists that do weight loss, or seeing anxious people with nervous twitches, try and do anxiety hypnotherapy, it's kind of like, well, hold on a minute. If you're such a good hypnotherapist, how come you haven't fixed your own stuff? Is kind of my natural thought. And that's led me to be an advocate of congruency. So when I became specializing in phobias, I had a fear of doing stand-up comedy, and I made it a must for me. It's like, if I'm going to help other people with their irrational fears, I've got to face my own irrational fear. So I think there's that element, but and I say that from a congruency point of view, directly regarding hypnotic wealth. I'm not the wealthiest person by any stretch of the imagination, but I have been able to create passive sources of income. I've been able to acquire assets. I've been able to build multiple businesses, and my net worth is in the multiple millions of pounds in my early 40s. So I'm not saying that I've got all the answers, and I'm kind of like, I'm not a kind of a Zuckerberg or anything like that, but I have, compared to the average person, which is actually a very low net worth or even negative net worth for a lot of people, that's a legitimate kind of level that I've been able to get to. And I also understand hypnosis and belief systems and those things. So hypnotic wealth really is looking at what it takes to develop the right kind of thinking, whether you call that mindset, beliefs, strategies, whatever, to become wealthy. And the first key part of that comes down to risk. It comes down to what my parents thought, oh, business is too risky, property too risky, investing is too risky. The only thing that they did from a wealth perspective that they didn't consider risky, they linked to security, not risk, is owning their own house. So that's their biggest asset. That's their biggest source of wealth, is that they own their own property, and their net worth is directly related to the value of that. But everything else was too risky. So every other element of wealth is kind of, it couldn't have been there because they would never have pursued that. So when I do the talk, I actually get people to, I use the metaphor of time travel. So everyone has their favorite time travel movie. So Adrian, I'm going to ask you, what's your favorite time travel movie?
Back to the Future.
Of course it is, the old DeLorean. So if you remember Back to the Future 2, where old Biff goes back to younger Biff and gives him the almanac with all of the sporting results, there is a reason why younger Biff becomes so financially successful. And that is, at that point, there is zero risk. He has certainty. He has absolute certainty that the decisions he makes is going to pay off to a ludicrous degree. And when he knows that they work, he repeats the process and basically becomes Donald Trump. That's basically, Back to the Future 2. So if you had a time machine and you went back with the knowledge that you had now, and you could have a chat with a version of you 10 years ago, that 10-year-old version of you, or the younger version of you when it becomes now, is guaranteed to be wealthy because of that knowledge or insight. Now, the advice that you're going to give that version of you 10 years younger isn't going to be to get a job in corporate. It's not going to be that. It might be to buy Tesla stock or Google stock or Bitcoin at a certain time and then sell at a certain time. But it certainly isn't going to be an employee. And the reason is because there are proven wealth strategies that involve assets, generally appreciating assets or assets derived cash flow. But people don't do it because they have fears, and the fears relate to risks, and the fears are often a reflection of the beliefs, and the beliefs limit their ability to feel resourceful or take action in those things. If I believe that, so many people have said, oh, it's crazy to buy a property at auction. Well, I wouldn't be sitting in a £500,000 asset right now if I had that belief then, didn't take the action, and then bought that property. Now, I'm in a £500,000 asset right now, but the cost to me wasn't 500,000. It was about 35,000. I got a mortgage for the rest of it. And then that asset has appreciated in value over time to the extent that my £35,000 thing, probably less what's remaining on the commercial loan, probably made me about 400 grand. So I've turned 35,000 into 400,000 because I had a different belief about the risk involved, the element of upside versus downside. It's all in my head. It had nothing to do with anything else other than how I perceived about the situation, which led me to make a particular decision at a point in time or not. And then you can leverage that even more. So one of the things that I talk about is, given that we don't have a time machine and we don't have the absolute certainty of going on, it therefore requires an experimental approach when it comes to investing. So, I've got around about 600,000 now invested in either pensions or stocks and shares, but I didn't start with 600,000. I started with a few £1,000s, and then you get comfortable with funds and trading and the nature of the dashboards that you see. In the same way that, let's say you like poker or a card game or something like that. Should you bet on the very first time that you're going to play that game? Well, definitely not. You're not competent in it. You don't know the rules. You don't know the strategy. So get good playing the game, develop an experimental approach. So you get to test things out in very low amounts. And then you can scale up at that point. And I think that's really what I talk about in terms of hypnotic wealth, is that, okay, there's a lot of things at play here in the deep unconscious mind. Fears aren't normally conscious. Beliefs aren't normally conscious. Knowledge, unless you recall a particular thing, is normally deep in the unconscious mind. So what better than hypnosis to make changes at an unconscious level to enable people to develop new options, new choices, so that a wealthy future becomes viable. And a lot of people have such ridiculous beliefs about money, and you see it in the media, you see it in social media posts, like all the millionaires with their mansions, blah, blah, blah. And it's kind of like the ludicrousness around some of the stuff that's said, because it's just projecting cliches and stereotypes and false beliefs. But if someone believes that to be rich, you have to be mean or ruthless, and they don't align with that value, then they are subconsciously, sabotaging their ability to be wealthy, and they don't even know it. And this is the thing: the vast majority of people that are in debt or have very low personal net worths, they're not consciously choosing that. That's just an end result of their programming, their beliefs, their ideas, their fears, and that happens to be where they are. But if you, just like I did when I was an anxious teenager, crippled by fears, if you take responsibility and say, I am where I am financially because of what's going on in my head, and if I change what's in my head, then I can change my future, which is true in my view of the world, then absolutely anyone can be wealthy. Absolutely anyone. But not if everything stays exactly as it is at the moment. A change has to take place. Otherwise, the law of momentum says you're going to follow your trajectory as to wherever that plays out.
I think that's a very important perspective, is that there has to be a point, a change. There has to be a reason, I would say, to change and to change those beliefs, and to want to be more wealthy, or to have that desire to be more wealthy, because wanting to be more wealthy to pay off your debt, or to get out of debt, or to make more money, I think it has to be a greater motivation to generate that money. Like you said earlier, it's about having that sense of freedom. So you're not going to work for anyone else, you're going to work for yourself. And when you created your business, I know that you said the PR agency you felt like is a bit of a thorn in the side, but actually the PR agency enabled you then to become a hypnotherapist. It gave you that freedom to go in and to do something which was really in line with your self-expression, something you really desired to do. So I think wealth, I remember somebody who's on the podcast, a guy called David, wealth gives you time, it gives you options. So you're able then to have more choice when you're impacted with fears or a lower net worth. You don't have as much choice. So you might take a client on that's probably not in line with what you really want to do, or you might take some work that you don't really want to do. Whereas when you start to create wealth, have a higher purpose around it, and really understand about what it really means to you to be wealthy, I think then what happens is you're driving, or you're moving towards a life that you truly want, rather than a life that's almost been given to you through conditioning, through fears, from learnt those behaviors. You almost have to unlearn that conditioning. So there's almost like a space of nothingness, and then you get like a clean sheet of paper, like the obviously the metaphors talk to our unconscious mind. So I like the use of the Back to the Future metaphor. But often those stories, those metaphors, and the stories that we tell ourselves around wealth, if we can start to write that story down, it becomes very apparent. Then we have an opportunity to create a new story. But I think what's fundamental around listening to you, and from my own experiences, when we create that new story, it's about creating momentum towards that newer story. Like, I think there's a lot of people that want to start their own business and maybe employed. I remember working with a coaching client who was employed, but now they've got their own coaching business, and they recognized the need for change. They realized that it was unfulfilling in their role, and they felt inspired to start their own coaching business, to work with other people. And I remember them, I think them specifically, and a lot of people get so overwhelmed with, oh my God, I'm working where I am now, I want to start my own company, and there's so many ladders, so many steps, I just feel completely overwhelmed. And the mindset shift that I got them to do was so simple. And afterwards, they got their first client. I just said, right, just go and get your business cards printed with coach on them. And they went and got the business cards printed. And then all of a sudden, that is a very small mindset shift. So I think what you're saying, it's not it's having big goals, but it's about those small increments. Okay, now what? Now what? What could I do now? And those very small increments in the right direction, combined with the right story, because as you say, the story talks to our subconscious mind, which is very metaphoric and symbolic, then we're starting to move towards the right direction. And then what we have is a feedback loop. And I like what you said previously, no failure, only feedback. But when we have that feedback loop, the law of confirmation bias proves to us that we are now on a new trajectory, and what we are doing is working at some level. So I really like the elements that you were speaking around creating business and creating that wealth trajectory as well.
And also something as simple as changing a business card for the vast majority of people. When people say, you know, what do you do? They talk about their profession. You know, so that's at the, you know, if we're talking about Dilt's logical levels, going back to NLP, if someone simply changes their employee title or profession to coach, actually there is a shift at the identity logical level, which then changes everything, changes their beliefs, changes their resources, changes actions, everything. So people, I think, sometimes think that change has to be painful or it has to be complicated. No, sometimes very simple changes, if they're the right changes, can have, you know, huge leverage and a massive ripple effect.
Yeah, I think it doesn't have to be too complex. You don't have to go through like, right, today I'm going to face my biggest fear because it's blocking me from being successful and wealthy. It's, you know, what's the simplest, most easiest changes. Sometimes it's staring us in the face, because I had a conversation a few days ago with somebody, and yes, I've always been a mindset coach, and yes, I work with professionals and teach them how to become a coach and start their own coaching business by certifying them. And I also work in a slightly deeper lens with very much embodied coaching, at the somatic coaching at the level of being. So, like what you said, changing those identity level beliefs. So that's something that I've always done, but I never really truly got what I did for people, because I didn't take that time to self-reflect. And actually I had a very profound conversation about a week ago where somebody just said, well, you're here to help the real awakening, which is awakening leadership. And then it sounds so obvious, it sounds so simple, but I really got it. That's what I've been doing all my life, and that's what I'm here to do. But I think when we have that love to learn and that love to search and to find the next thing, sometimes there's something staring us obviously in the face, but we're like, oh no, it can't be that, and you keep on searching. So actually, to the people that are listening, there's something that's so simple that you've done all your life, that's a theme of your life, and something that you know, so obvious. Take the time to work out what that was, or what that is, sorry. So that's a very profound insight for me from the last week. But as we're coming up to the final part of the podcast, I know that you've a fellow podcaster as well, and it'd be good to understand your motivation for doing the podcast, and also where you think podcast is going, and some of the things that you've learned on your podcast host journey.
Yeah, so I became an accidental podcaster. I became an accidental broadcaster. Running a broadcast PR company, we prior to lockdown needed to rent out a lot of high-end studios, because we'd have celebrities and spokespeople in studios connecting with lots of different kind of radio stations across, you know, the day. And I heard about a radio station called Share Radio, which is a personal finance radio station. They had gone from a DAB, so a digital radio station, to an internet-only radio station. I knew they had downsized a little bit, and I thought they might have excess studio that I could hire. So I arranged for a meeting with the owner of the radio station. And it was meant to be a 10-minute chat. We ended up speaking for about 2 hours, went out for lunch. And he starts saying, well, look, you know, the studios definitely aren't what you need, but if you ever want to create content that we could also use on the radio station, then that's fine. Let me know. So literally a week later, we had a cybersecurity company that was talking about how hackers use human emotion to exploit them. And that might be greed, or it might be fear, or it might be curiosity. So I had a half an hour chat with this guy, like vice president of security for this like top, you know, global cybersecurity company. And it was quite an interesting episode. And I did that, and I sent it to the guys. And then literally 2 days later, I get an email saying, that was amazing. When's the next episode? And I'm like, well, there is no next episode. And they're like, no, 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 we want another one. So then I started, basically looking at people I was already connected to that might have interesting things to say about mindset. And then we came up with a name, which was Modern Mindset. So for 2 years, and I've been at that radio station now for 3 years, but for 2 years, I was recording shows for them weekly, half an hour shows. And then around about a year ago, they decided to put a paywall on that radio station, on the internet radio station. And I had a feeling that by putting a paywall, the audience number would go down.
Mm.
So I thought, right, well, I enjoy doing the show, because what had happened completely accidentally, but by me interviewing all these kind of coaches and kind of people involved in personal finance, my personal network had grown, and I got offered speaking opportunities and to be in summits and all this kind of stuff, purely as a result of kind of just interviewing these people. So at the point where they put the paywall, I thought, well, I'm going to turn this into a podcast, but with the benefit of having 100 episodes already recorded, that gets me off to a nice start. So that's Modern Mindset. And I've been doing that 3 years as a radio show, and then since March as a podcast. And that's doing good. And I love the ability to network, because it's a weird thing. Like when if let's say you, Adrian, I said, oh, you're an interesting person, I just reach out on social media. Can I talk to you for a bit? You'd be like, who's this weirdo? But if I say, hey, look, I've got this radio show and podcast, Modern Mindset, and I think you'd be a great guest, you'd be like, oh, okay, that sounds interesting. So it enables me as an introvert, to facilitate interesting conversations with interesting people that kind of grows my network. When the lockdown started in March, as a hypnotherapist working in Harley Street, I thought, I'm going to have less hypnosis clients. So I thought, okay, well, I still want to have this outlet for me to do hypnosis. And for me, I don't just want to be a hypnotherapist. I want to be the world's most innovative hypnotherapist. So I thought, okay, well, a podcast, because I had a feeling I was pretty good, but nobody knows how good they are unless you put yourself out in the public and say, right, evaluate me at some level. So again, I'm quite a bit of an audio geek with all my kind of microphones and stuff, but as an extra bonus, when I worked with hypnosis clients, I would record in very good quality and send the recording to them so that they could listen to that hypnosis session again. So the premise of The Hypnotist, which is my second podcast, is that people can listen to real hypnotherapy, not just scripts, recordings and things like that, but real hypnotherapy with real clients facing real issues. And my evaluation on what happened, so that if they've got a similar issue, they could benefit from that hypnotherapy session without having to pay me, a few £100s for a single session. So the payoff to them is free hypnosis. The payoff to me is that I get to raise my profile and raise my credibility. And, I had no expectations for it. I just kind of got a little bit of an intro recorded. I got a weird Photoshop, kind of picture of me with a green eye. Like it looks very cheesy, but it kind of works as a premise. And I'm averaging about 1,000 downloads a day now on something which is basically just me doing hypnosis. But I think it's because people connect with it in some way. They're able to get some kind of change through hypnosis that wasn't necessarily recorded for them. It's never bespoke, because obviously they have to work with me direct for that. But what I've done for someone else, chances are someone in the world has got a similar problem and they can benefit from something else. And it's that metaphor of, a candle doesn't lose its power if you light another candle. So the fact that I've done a hypnosis session for one person, if they've experienced this incredible change, just because someone else listens to the same recording or the same experience that they've had, that doesn't detract from their therapy and their impact, but someone else could also benefit from that. And, for me, that's been great. And weirdly now, most of my clients come from my podcast and YouTube channel. So my cost per acquisition, it used to cost me about £50 to acquire a hypnosis client. That's now like 50p or something like that. My cost per acquisition is virtually nothing. So it's become more profitable for me. I get more referrals, more credibility. I get invited to speak again at all these different kind of summits and events and stuff. So I'm a big fan of podcasting, so long as the expectations of the podcast, when people think, I'm going to have millions of downloads and I'm going to get loads of clients, it's kind of like, don't do it for that reason. Do it for, creative expression. Do it for networking. Do it for impact on the people that you're going to, have that you're communicating to. And what you'll find is that the side effects are quite good as well, but don't do it to monetize it. When I see people, I mean, there's a few people that sell podcasting courses like monetize your podcast, be rich doing podcasts. It's like, unless you're Joe Rogan, you're not going to be rich doing podcasts. But there are ways that you can creatively use a podcast that makes it the equivalent of writing a book or the equivalent of being a columnist in a newspaper. There's real genuine credibility, thought leadership, and value from being a podcaster, but do it for the right reasons.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned about introversion as well, being introvert, because a lot of people might think that I'm more extroverted, but actually I'm quite introverted. I like my time to kind of regenerate as well. So I relate to that. And actually my motivation for doing my podcast is very much like what you just said, which is around creative self-expression. It gives me an opportunity every week to self-express and to feel that aliveness around the ability to share your wisdom to help other people. And I think that's going back to what we first said around, there was an analogy of creating wealth and boxing. Don't focus on really focus on money and trying to hit the boxing ball. Actually focus your attention around it, because then trusting in right timing, then wealth and opportunities will be created from putting that energy within to things like self-expression, creating impact with other people, or like what you put on your goal is to create 1 million. I don't know if it was 1 million downloads on your hypnosis, but your motivation for your podcast around building your network, for instance, and also self-expression has enabled you to get 1,000 downloads a day, which is amazing. I'll definitely be looking at my podcast goals and how I'm setting up my podcast and looking at creating some more awareness around the focus point of the podcast, specifically probably more around self-expression, bringing in more lives as well. That's something that I'm considering doing. And also bringing that awakening leadership, the helping people with a call to lead. That's probably a big motivation that's come in now. So I really like those points. Don't set the podcast up to monetize, set it up around slightly different motivations.
Oh, massively. And if you look at, I mean, the world's biggest podcaster, Joe Rogan, he's on like 1,600 episodes, something like that. The idea that, he was sat there and 10 years ago said, right, I'm going to set up a podcast so I can sell it to Spotify for $100 million. No, he just thought, okay, there's this opportunity for me to have interesting conversations with cool people and see what comes up. And the consequence of that is that it's now gone to this massive thing that, is, very impactful and very influential, but he didn't set out for it to do that way. And I think people are very aware, I think, if people have, selfish motives for doing stuff. And sometimes you can see this kind of things that are done on social media or YouTube or podcasting, which is clearly just to boost the ego of the individual. There's very little more payoff. It's, look how amazing, look how fun I am. And I think that doesn't build rapport, that doesn't build connection. But if people feel like genuinely there is something of value there, that, you get to be the fly on the wall of this interesting conversation that you wouldn't have heard except for this little vehicle, then great, people benefit. And I think, I'm learning that sometimes, although I'm a big goal setter and I love setting intentions and I'm quite strategic about how I do them, sometimes I just like doing stuff with no intention, but just as a way of, and that's why I call my hypnosis business a lucrative hobby. It's not a business for me. and it's projected to earn over 100,000 this year. And people say, well, that makes it a business. It's kind of like, no, it doesn't. I'm choosing to have it as a hobby. It's a hobby that makes me money. But while it's a hobby for me, I'm doing it because it's fun. I'm doing it because I choose to. I'm doing it because I like doing it. I definitely don't have to do it. And for me, the connotations for a hobby is so much more positive than if it's, I already have a business. I don't need a second business. So I'll have my main business, and then I'll have my lucrative hobby, and then I'll have podcasting as a hobby, and I'll have property investing as a hobby. And having lots of hobbies makes me more interesting, but it doesn't put the pressure on me to feel like I'm managing multiple businesses and all this kind of stuff. No, I've got a main business and I've got loads of hobbies.
Yeah, that's interesting, because something I've learned recently is around listening to your intuition around what are you most drawn to, as in actually what, from an embodied level, what are you most drawn to energetically. And I think once we can listen to that, because the mind always wants to create the meaning around certain things, and yes, it is useful, the mind, but your body will tell you what you're most interested in when the right timing is. So it's really asking yourself, what are you most drawn to, because then you energetically move to those things. And I suppose you've got a lot more to accomplish within your life, but at the moment, those different areas, those hobbies and that business are the things that you're most drawn to. So people that are listening, look at something, whether it's a hobby, a creative passion, or work that you're most drawn to, and your body will tell you. And what will normally happen is, when you're most drawn to something, you'll get an expansive feeling, and when you're not drawn to something, you'll get a contractive feeling. And sometimes that's a great way to tell you where to move next.
Yeah, and for me, the intuition is it's the communication between the unconscious mind and the conscious mind. So
Mm.
whether that's a feeling in your body, or inner dialogue, or some kind of daydream, or whatever it might be, your unconscious is way more aware than people ever give it credit for. But the only way that you're going to know that is by paying attention to it. And I think listening to yourself, that inner dialogue. But as you say before, having those journals, having the ability to get stuff out of your head in a way that you can actually kind of process, that's where you can make great decisions. I became a hypnotherapist entirely because my intuition kept telling me there's something there. And when I finally listened to it, and I ignored it for like 10 years, but when I finally listened to it, my life took a positive direction, so absolutely, you need to listen. That intuition, and it's a weird thing, because sometimes intuition can't, isn't helpful. If it's an inner dialogue that represents your fears and insecurities, that might not be, you can't just listen to it verbatim, but it's a start of a process of detective work. Because if your inner dialogue is saying, I can't do that, that will never work, then figure out what belief must you have to have in order for that intuition and inner dialogue to keep coming up in that way. And then ask yourself, is that still a useful belief to have? And if you can't fix it yourself, find someone that can help you with that. But the clues are there, but you just have to dig a bit deeper, play detective, and try and figure out the puzzle of what's happening, and make it work for you rather than against you.
Yeah, and final point on that is that there will be people listening that want a level of change within their life, within their mindset, within their career. And to Adam's point right at the start of the podcast, it's about that responsibility for change. You have to, at some level, be open to it and recognize that there's something to be changed, and take the first step. And the first step doesn't have to be, going through 6 coaching sessions. It could just be researching how to do that on the internet, or reaching out to a coach that you resonate with. So for my final tips from listening, it's about that responsibility for change. But I just want to thank you, Adam, for coming on the podcast today, and really appreciate your time and coming on to the podcast. Specifically, some of the learnings are, it's around that when we're feeling that level of anxiousness, or feeling like we're stuck, we still have power to change, and it's just slowing those things down, and we can change our lives. And when we look at the themes across our lives, there is always learnings from parents, teachers, and whatever the story is that we've created around those, that whatever that meaning is, we can create a more useful and empowering story through that. And that creating wealth isn't this strategic plan, 7 steps or 8 steps, whichever one kind of peddles on the internet. That actually it's I think it's looking at what really you enjoy, inspires you, and what you would like to embody or move towards. And it's just taking those simple steps through that. And it's not about trying to get it all figured out. It's just, what have I got in front of me now, and what could the next few steps be? And also the power of being able to write down, externalize what our internal dialogue is saying, and then actually we do have the ability to change that. And self-reflection is very important, as well as having goals, aspirations, and dreams, if you will, that are more towards motivated rather than fear-based, and the importance of that. So those are some of my takeaways from today. So thank you very much for coming onto the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me on the podcast. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Cheers, Adam. So thank you very much for everybody listening. You've been listening to the Superhuman Journeys podcast with myself, Adrian Hales, and Adam Cox. Thank you.